G'day, welcome to another episode of the Fighting Men of Rhodesia YouTube series. My guest today is Major Nick Fawcett from the RAR. The way I came across Nick was in talk 305 with Hamish Jim Peters. Nick was mentioned quite a lot in that talk because he assisted Jim in setting up protected villages in the Hondi Valley. And so our guest, as I said, is Nick, and welcome to you, Nick. Welcome aboard to the program.
Thank you very much, Tony, and I'm honored to be here.
It's good to see you, and I believe we were chatting offline that you're in Harare, and it's as hot as Hades there at the moment. Is that right?
Blistering, absolutely blistering. Yeah.
Oh, shame. Well, unfortunately, you've got power, so that's one good thing.
Well, hold thumbs on that.
Yeah. If I turn my camera around, I would show you a very grey, miserable, typical English day, nice and cold. But I'm glad you're warm. It would be nice to be halfway between, I suppose. So, Nick, as we usually do in these programs, we ask the guests to explain where they were born, where they went to school, and how they actually ended up in the army.
Okay, well, I was born into a military family. My father was Lieutenant Colonel, commanding the 3rd, 5th Parachute Battalion of the Maratha Light Infantry in a place called Multan, which finished up in Pakistan after the partition of India. And my grandfather was in the Indian Army Engineers. So that was my pedigree. And then my father was killed in a very bizarre incident just before he was due to demob at the end of 1947. I was 10 months old. And what was left of my family, in fact, my mother, my brother, myself, all came out to Southern Rhodesia, as it was, because my grandfather had settled here. So we joined forces, and I grew up under my grandfather's roof. And he was a great lover of martial music. So he had a great collection of short playing and long, or 78s and long playing records of military bands. So it wasn't unusual to see me marching up and down the lounge to the band of the Coldstream Guards when I was about 5 years old. And I kind of think that that preordained me for a career in the military, because after I left school, and I went to school at Avondale and then Peterhouse, and after I left school, I went off and did my national service with the intention of going to Sandhurst. If I tell you that I was at Llewellyn on the 11th of November 1965, you'll know why I never got to Sandhurst, because we were all called to the canteen to hear the Prime Minister speak, and of course he told us that UDI had been declared, and that was basically that. But I then signed up for the Rhodesian Army and applied to go to School of Infantry at Welladua Cadet Course there. That's how I happened to get into the Army.
And obviously you came out with the rank of second lieutenant. What year was that, and do you remember the names of any of your peers?
Yes, I do. I obviously I remember them all. But it was at the end of 1966. Well, I'm happy to share that with you off camera. But yes, I had a great bunch of people that I shared my life with over that 1 year period. We worked really hard, and of course we had to, because of what was going to come in the future. Although the culture in the Army was very much to do with Malaya and perhaps a little bit of Burma, but mainly Malaya. So the tactics and so on was based on that experience that a lot of our guys had had. So yeah, at the end of the cadet course, I was lucky enough to have my nose just in front, and I managed to get the Sword of Honor. I think my mother was far more proud than I was, but obviously I was delighted, and gave me my choice of regiment, which was RLI. So I was, throughout my Army career, badged RLI as my parent regiment. I just happened to do an ERE attachment to RAR, which I will talk about, and I remember very fondly. So that was my first posting with RLI as a second lieutenant, and I finished up there as I arrived there as the commander of 4 Troop in 1 Commando under Major Peter Rich, who was a very fine soldier and leader with a most unbelievable dry sense of humor. Anyway, RLI at that stage in 1967 was on mainly border control. So the first thing that Peter Rich did was to send me off on an SAS escape and evasion course, which, of course, I was still very green behind the ears, and it was a real eye-opener. I came away from that very fit and hard, but realizing that I knew far too little about survival and tracking and anti-tracking and so on. So I was very much underexperienced. But 1967 was a year when we could do a lot of border control work, and I absolutely loved border control. It was, I hate to say it because maybe my superiors are listening in, but it was like being on a glorified camping trip. You had your Land Rovers, you had your own space, and you went into the wilds of the Zambezi Valley and Mana Pools. And it was a perfect thing for me to get to know my troops and also to get to understand how to interact with dangerous game. And of course, at that time, the Zambezi Valley could boast the Big Five and how. So there was lots to learn. And my first real brush with big game was at a long-term ambush, which Major Rich asked us to lay at a certain crossroads near the Chawuri River. And we barely got ourselves in on night 1 when we heard crackling in the bush, and we thought, we've got a scene about to develop here. And into our killing zone walked this great big black rhino bull. And he stood there, knew we were there, and he stood there and he watched us for a while, and we dared not even breathe. And then suddenly he snorted and came barreling at us full tilt. Well, we levitated out of that ambush position and bombshelled into the surrounding bush while he came charging through, snorting and charging around in circles looking for us. Well, how we got out of that, I don't know. But we all survived, and we sheepishly got back into our ambush position. But we were all giggling so much because of the various things that people got up to, trying to climb trees and finding themselves still on the ground because it was a sapling and it had bent over. 2 people trying to get up the same tree. It was just chaos. And having got through that first night, we thought, this is okay. And then, of course, it happened every night for the next 4 nights until we were gibbering idiots. And I got hold of Major Rich and I said, look, we've got to move ambush position because we are being pestered by this rhino. He wasn't in the slightest bit concerned about it, but I had to do it because sooner or later, one of us would have been trampled overboard. Anyway, that was the first of those lessons that I learned on border control. 67, of course, was the year that the big incursions took place, and one of those was nickel in Matabele land. And so there were some pretty hairy contacts taking place there, and 2 Commando was sent over there to join up with 1 RAR. They got into some contacts, and I was green with envy because that's all I wanted to do was to be a real soldier and have contacts and so on. Anyway, that was all that really happened in 67, but it was a good sort of training ground for me. And at the end of the year, Major Peter Rich got some intel that there was to be a large incursion, similar to the nickel one, taking place near the Chawuri mouth. Now, I'm not quite sure what happened down at the Chawuri mouth, but we were assigned to long-term ambushes in the escarpment. And Peter Rich decided that he was going to have a very covert operation. So he arranged that we should be driven in along the fly fence, and then we'd get out, and with 7 days' rations, we would walk into our ambush positions, more or less on the lip of the escarpment. And I drew the short straw because I got a place called Sorry Pools. Now, although it was spelled S-O-R-E, I think it should have spelled our way, been spelled our way, because it was a very tough month that we spent in this ambush, because it was either blistering hot, like it is here now, or raining cats and dogs. And we found that all day we were out patrolling, and then at night it was a night ambush, and the buffalo bean was everywhere along the river. It was not the kind of fun border control that I was used to. But I did learn a huge amount about map reading and route finding, because I suddenly realized that we were following the road or the track in and out, which went over the tops of the gomos so that you wouldn't have to have too much drainage. And it was exhausting with our 7 days rations each week going up and down that road. And we realized that we could follow the elephant paths in and out, and it was a whole lot easier. That was my big takeaway from that particular trip. As it turned out, the intel was good, because 3 months later, Dave Scammell was patrolling in the valley, and he came across this huge set of tracks, which was the start of our Cauldron. And I don't know if you want to dwell on anything I've just said, but that now I can take up the story on that.
Yes, please. If you want to expand on that, any of your experiences related to Op Cauldron would be interesting, because it was really the official start of the war, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it was and it wasn't, because we had a lull, really, with lesser operations in between before Op Hurricane started. And the other thing was that the whole insurgent strategy for Op Hurricane was different from what we'd experienced, and I'll come to that. But when the tracks were found in the valley, RLI was mobilized. 3 Commando got onto the score, and I understand that 2 Commando were there in support, and 4L1 Commando was stuck into the escarpment again to be the ambushes for the people that missed the net, so-called, down in the valley. Of course, that was bitterly disappointing for me, because, again, all my buddies were having their contacts down in the valley while we were cooling our heels on the escarpment. The problem with that kind of situation is that there are all these false alarms that you get, and they become wild goose chases, and every spoor that was ever found by anybody was treated with the greatest of suspicion. So I found myself reacting to all these things, but the worst one of all affected my troop, and it happened when we were on a very arduous patrol looking for spoor east of Shamrock Mine, which is, again, northeast of Karoi. The elephant grass was incredibly thick, and we were literally having to push our way through. But the worst part of that was that we kept coming across these little families of francolins. They're called spurfowl now, which would literally explode out of the grass at our feet and go cackling off into the air. And we'd all have a mini heart attack. And I was really getting sick of these things, until Peter Rich got hold of me on the radio and said, look, there's been a sighting by a 1 Commando OP, observation post, and they've got some movement, and they reckon some insurgents visual on a ridge about 800 meters from their position. But of course, the relief, or should I say the ups and downs in that area, are massive. And so you know, from the top of the ridge down to the bottom of the valley is a huge drop. And so Peter had said to me, get ready for uplift. We're going to send some choppers to you. Well, where I was, I couldn't find any LZ. So we had to trot back to the our base camp, where at least we knew there was an open enough area for choppers to land. We got picked up there straight away and flown to the scene. While we were going, the OP was saying, yeah, I can still see them. They're still moving around in that area. And yeah, it seemed like good news. And then as the choppers sort of passed close by, the OP said, yes, yes, I saw them duck down as soon as the choppers came by. So we thought, well, this is a definite, you know, it's all going to happen. Then we couldn't find any LZs because of the steepness of the terrain. And so eventually we deplaned at about 3 meters above the ground and crashed in, but fortunately no serious injuries. And we got shaken out and we began sweeping up this ridge. And all the while the OP was saying, look, they're still there, we can still see them. And we went on and on and on, and we were whispering because, you know, we didn't know how far, you know, the insurgents were. And so the whole of RLI was listening in on the conversation because we were right on top of this hill. And, you know, there was dead silence, radio silence, everybody except us. And eventually the OP said, look, I can see you, and you're very close to the camp. Well, I couldn't see anything. I was still creeping up, and now I was leopard crawling. We were all leopard crawling up this ridge, and we leopard crawled for 50 meters, 100 meters, and then we thought, no, come on, this can't be right. So I looked around me. I saw some jumbled rocks that we just passed through. So I stood up and went and stood on one of these rocks, and I said to the OP, I got out my map and waved it in the air. I said, am I standing on an insurgent? There was dead silence for a few seconds, and then he said, yes, you are. Well, you could almost hear the 500 expletives coming from all the people listening in on the radios. And of course, Major Rich was incandescent because both his call signs had made a laughing stock of one commander. But he composed himself. He said to me in a voice that was icy calm, okay, call sign 14, you can make your way back to your base camp. Now, the base camp was like that and like that. And, you know, we set off, and the closest we managed to get was down into the bottom of the Angwa River that night. And we had a miserable, cold and hungry night because we hadn't had time to pick up any rations or any bedrolls or anything like that. So we had this miserable night there, all the while thinking of how we'd been conned, and carried on and got back to our base camp at 12 o'clock the next day. Then Major Rich said, okay, we're withdrawing you back to HQ, which was at the top of the escarpment. And we got back there and put into reserve. And almost immediately, somebody reported tracks at the bottom of the escarpment at Marangora. So we were packed off to go and have a look. And sure enough, we found some spoor, and it was definitely figure-of-8 pattern boots. And as you probably know, that's where the figure-of-8 pattern boot became notorious. And but do you think we could catch these guys? There were 3 of them. And we chased them around a tiny area, about 5,000 meters square, for 3 days, and we never caught up with them. And eventually, they disappeared out of the area, and we lost the spoor. So now we didn't know whether they went out to the river or up the escarpment or what. So Peter Rich took us back. But the final insult was a few weeks later. They were dealt with by Commando headquarters themselves, with Peter Rich and the Commando 2IC and the signalers and people like that went out, and they caught up with them in Shurundu. So that was really rubbing salt in the wound. But anyway, I could be forgiven for being a little bit skeptical when somebody called us out. I can't remember who it was, and said, look, there's been some insurgent equipment found on a farm in Karoi, and would you get yourself up there and go and take a look? So I thought, okay, here we go again. So off we went, and it was a long drive there, actually, and we arrived at this farm just before last light, and the farmer was there, and he said, yeah, here's the water bottle. It was indeed a sort of Chinese or East European pattern. So I said, okay, well, that's fair enough. And he said, and there's a base camp there, which I'm going to take you to tomorrow morning. So the following morning, we got up, and I went with the farmer, and we went and found this base camp. It was hidden in thick bush on his farm, and we could find between sort of 8 and 10 resting places. And yeah, it seemed to be fairly good intel so far. We had 3 trackers there and a party stick. The 3 trackers were 2 policemen and 1 national parks, and they were absolutely outstanding. And when we got on the spoor, they really shunted. There was a lot of aerial spoor from late summer grass, so that was good in our favor, and we belted along. So by the end of the first day, we caught up until we were only 8 hours behind after, sorry, 12 hours behind after being 48 that morning. So we reckoned we were doing pretty well. We lost the spoor at last light, and then camped at a nearby farm. Major John Hickman, who was the battalion 2IC, came out early the following morning. He said, what are you doing still hanging around here? I said, well, we're waiting for the trackers to find the spoor, which they duly did ere too long, and we got underway again. But the insurgents were anti-tracking every time they came to anything like a track or a road or a stream or a fence, and that helped us in a way, because it enabled us to regain our formation, because at the speed we were traveling, guys were sort of getting lost, and not lost, but out of earshot and so on, and out of visual distance. So but we made good progress, and then late morning the trackers said, okay, we're going to be making contact ere too long. I was terrified that my colleagues in 1 Commando would steal a march on me and get in ahead of me by leapfrogging ahead of us. But then early afternoon, yeah, the trackers said, your gunner is trying to contact you. And I got to where I could see the gunner, and he was pointing ahead of him. And with the hand signals, he explained that about 25 meters up front, there were three insurgents there. So we then began creeping forward, and when I came over a small rise, there was one guy. I could only see one, but he looked like he was sitting on the ground. Actually, he was standing in a trench. But at that moment, he turned around both ways, and then you could see that he'd seen somebody, and he said something to his buddies, and he reached forward, which we thought might be for a weapon, and so we opened fire. And then all hell was let loose. Guys jumped up and started running, and the weight of fire coming down from us was huge. So they sort of disappeared from view, and then a huge firefight started with the guys in these trenches, and I didn't know they were in trenches at that stage, sticking their weapons over the lip of the trench and just blazing away into the bush. And very sadly, my MAG gunner was hit in the first few minutes of the contact and killed. And then when the RPG-2s, as they were then, came out, the Partu stick leader who was with us, he got badly wounded from shrapnel. So yeah, we took a few casualties there, but then it became a long grind while we tried to move our flanking sections into an area where they could see down the trenches because we didn't know where these guys were hiding, but we knew they were still there because they were firing like crazy things. And finally, our flanking section managed to get into the right position, and then it was all over pretty quickly. And we discovered at the end that there were only 7 in the group, and we'd managed to get 7. So when Peter Rich heard that, he was absolutely over the moon, because to him, 7 out of 7, I know we'd lost 1 killed and 1 wounded, but 7 out of 7 would put the ghost of the Bobo hunt that we'd had up on the mountain to rest. And by the way, from that Bobo hunt, one of the corporals, and I think it was 3 Commander Corporal May, who was a very good cartoonist, and he produced a selection of cartoons which he called Cauldron Capers, and that Bobo hunt was one of them. And together with a whole lot of other brilliant cartoons, they were put up in the RLI officers' mess snooker room, and for years they were there. I don't know if they're still there with the Commando Battalion, but they were there when I last saw them. So anyway, we came away from that feeling a lot happier that we'd also buried the ghost. And then later on, that was in 1968. Later on in the year, of course, there were other operations which one commander didn't necessarily have a major role in. We had one that involved a group coming down to the very northeastern corner of Rhodesia, which was near a place called Baobab Beacon. And there's a big baobab at the very corner of the country near the Missouri River, where it exits into Mozambique. And so we found this spore south or southwest of that and followed it to the beacon, the baobab. And then we asked for permission to be allowed to follow up. And I was dying to do a hot pursuit into Mozambique because I thought we were close enough behind. And we waited and waited and waited for permission. And in the meantime, one of the LO3s, the helicopters, came and they landed in the river next door to us, and we had some business to do. I'm not quite sure what it was. Then he couldn't get started. And so, you know, we were stuck there anyway, guarding the helicopter. And that went on for the next 24 hours, by which time the rejection of our application came through, and we put it down to a monstrous lemon and went home. But yeah, that was I can't remember the name of it, but it was yeah, I probably got it somewhere, but it was perhaps Op Flotilla, it was, yeah. So anyway, that was that operation, but I did manage to get into an external, as we would have called it later on, because I became part of a team of Rhodesian officers who went into Mozambique on an op called Op Birthday. The plan was that we would go right up to the Zambian border in the Tet province. And there we would meet up with Portuguese army units. And there were 3 RLI subbies, myself included. And our job was to lead Portuguese platoons, which was quite an interesting challenge because we had a 0 language commonality. And I mean, I was using broken schoolboy French to try and communicate with these guys. We had SAS tracker combat teams, and I mean, it was quite a high-powered thing. And there were helicopters and ability to call on some Canberras, perhaps, and so on. But anyway, the whole operation was bedeviled by bad weather. The whole time we were having big storms and so on. And it was disappointing from that perspective. But I had a few takeaways. The first one was that I saw, I didn't study them well, but I saw the Portuguese Aldeamento, which was the protected village. I saw the impact that the concentration of people in these villages would have, in terms of reducing the number of murders, disciplinary murders by the insurgents, and also it completely changed the rules of war because, the rules of engagement, because that meant that in the spaces between the aldeamentos, there was a reasonable probability that the people that you were going to meet were going to be hostile. So I found that interesting. The second thing which I took away was that if you have a soft-skinned vehicle and a TM-46 mine, the soft-skinned vehicle comes off very badly. And we saw these bombed-out Bellier troop carriers, and I was very concerned about what happened to the troops in those vehicles. And the third one was, and this is an old adage, never be separated from your kit. And that happened when one of my RLI buddies and I were asked to go and check out a report. And we were told, look, just get your gap and go, you won't be long. And so we grabbed our weapons and got into the helicopter and off we went. And we were dropped down at the scene, and it turned out to be a lemon. The helicopter had gone back. So we asked for an uplift. And of course, the choppers were busy with something else. They couldn't come and fetch us. Then the rain came, and it set in for the night. And so between myself and my buddy, we had one, not even a shelter's lightweight. It was the old poncho with a hole in it. And so we desperately tried to keep warm and dry with one poncho between us. But then we had salt rubbed in the wound the next day because it was still clampers and the choppers couldn't come in. So they said to us, well, you'll have to get a lift. And what should come and collect us but a Bellier? And it was, in my opinion, very short on mine protection. But we got into it, and I was holding thumbs, crossing fingers, saying prayers all the way back to the base. But we made it unscathed. Anyway, so those are my three takeaways. If I carry on, you're happy for me to carry on?
Yes, you're doing very well. I just wanted to ask one question about the Portuguese troops. Did you find them reluctant? I've heard from other people that they preferred to stay in base camp and not actually venture out. Was there any truth in that?
Yeah, there are plenty of stories to that effect, and they were metropolitan Portuguese. They didn't really want to be there for this war. It was somebody else's war, but they were there. We didn't have a situation where we got into a really hot firefight or anything like that. So it was very hard for me to judge. I mean, when I was the few occasions when I was leading my Portuguese platoon, they seemed fine enough, and they weren't sort of saying we want to go home. So yeah, we also had the benefit of the SAS tracker combat units up ahead of us. So I think the troops behind me were thinking, well, they'll take the brunt of any ambush or anything like that. So, I think they were feeling reasonably secure.
On the other side of the coin, I've spoken to guys that were in combat with them, and they were praised as highly aggressive soldiers once the shit hit the fan. They didn't just cower down. So,
well, I'm glad to know that.
Yeah. Right.
Anyway, they had a tough assignment.
Indeed. I wouldn't like to be posted to South America to fight who knows what over there. It's just a horrible feeling. Why would you want to do it?
Yeah.
So what happened after that period in your life, Nick?
Okay. What happened to me then was in 1969, I was transferred or posted to battalion headquarters and appointed adjutant, which, amongst other duties, carried with it the responsibility of being personal assistant to the CO. And I was PA to Lieutenant Colonel John Hickman, MC, to start with, and then Lieutenant Colonel Derry McIntyre, who succeeded him. And I must say that it was wonderful wonderful experience to be able to watch these guys at work and to be able to try and emulate them when I later on got into those sort of exalted ranks. But yes, and it was great because they influenced my career too later on. I was always not very far from either of them in my future career. So yes, it was a great opportunity for me, good staff work, and yeah, altogether a very satisfying period in my life. But I missed the adventure from one commando. I really did, and I was very envious of when the guys were out on operations. So, but anyway, it is what it is.
Did you ever get a chance to play a prank back on Major or Captain Rich? At that point, he'd given you a hard time, hadn't he?
Well, no, he was actually very good to me. I can't remember ever playing a prank on him, but yeah, he had such a great sense of humor that it was wonderful to be in his commando.
Mm-hmm. And what type of things would you have done at the headquarters? Was it involved in supply? Was it administrative? What did you do there?
Yeah, well, it was very much confidential correspondence, administration of that. And you looked after the unit, the battalion HQ Woodley Room, where it came under my aegis, and also the military police also fell under the adjutant. But I mean, that was filtered through various other people, such as the RSM and the sergeant in charge of the military police. So yeah, I didn't have to do much in regard to other people's responsibilities, but my responsibility was very definitely confidential correspondence and the PA to the to the CO, and of course the discipline of the subalterns, and that was perhaps one of the hardest things in that job, because I was also still a lieutenant, and so were my buddies, and so I couldn't pull rank on them, but we reached a reasonable equilibrium, and they were pretty good.
Well, I remember the discipline of the RSM, so I can understand what it's like having to be a disciplinarian. I'm a little bit of a softie, and I don't think I could have ever got tough with my guys. It's just not in my nature.
Okay, well, yeah, it was hard, but I think one does it because that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
But I did that job for about 18 months. Mm-hmm. And then towards the end of 1971, I was posted to the School of Infantry, to start with as the course officer for a national service cadet course, with the idea that would cut my teeth for the regular officer cadet course the following year. I got married at the beginning of the following year, and then it was my privilege, and I call it a privilege, to be the course officer for the regular officer cadets for that year. And it was very special because you were in a position to watch these young guys who had been like me a few years before, go from boys to men in that 1 year that they were at the School of Infantry. I don't say that we were able to turn out the fully rounded officer in every respect, because I realized that I hadn't been fully rounded, because there were skills that I was going to acquire once I'd got into a more combat type role. So anyway, the interesting thing I found about the first course was that we were doing their final counterinsurgency exercise in December of that year. And we were at the Umfurudzi wildlife area, northeast of Harare, Salisbury as it was. And we got this report that 2 farms had been attacked, Altena and Whistlefield, and that a couple of RLI vehicles, or at least one, had hit a mine and they'd suffered a fatality and a serious injury. And I realized that this was a different kind of war to what we had seen in Cauldron and Nickel and Birch and Excess and those sort of operations, which had been very much taking place in unpopulated areas. This was a whole new ballgame. The insurgents had done their work very carefully, and had managed to program the local populace to support them, provide them with food, information, and so on. So I knew that these youngsters that I was going to be turning out at their passing out parade a few months or so down the road would be going straight into battle as second lieutenants. And it was a sobering thought because, you know, they still seemed a little boyish to me, but they certainly proved themselves when they got into their unit. And so that was it.
Sorry to interrupt there, Nick. I did a national service course at Osby's officers course, and I can honestly say that it was absolutely brilliant. It was so thorough. It covered everything that an infantry officer needed, from map reading to everything that you can imagine. It was really brilliant. I can't say enough about the way it was designed, the way it was implemented. It gave you all the tools. It was a fantastic time. It wasn't easy, but you know, the army's not easy.
It wasn't supposed to be easy.
Nah.
Yeah, and again, for the reason that they knew at the School of Infantry what you were going to go into. So yes, you're quite right. I think it's the work that had been done by the course designers and so on was outstanding.
Yeah.
So I was very honored to be able to run that course and the one that followed the next year. And the interesting thing about that one was that the operational attachment was with the RLI, and we found ourselves at Attack HQ on the Zambezi River inside Mozambique. I don't quite know where that was now, but at any rate, we arrived there when they were busy looking for a place called Central Base, and that was, I think, somewhere in Mozambique, and we teamed up with a couple of the RLI troops and went in support of the main follow-up operation, which was run by a guy called Dion Creel of RLI, and we were sort of moving towards the area where Dion was, and suddenly there was this almighty firing up ahead of us, and we realized that Dion had hit the central base. So this was exciting for the officer cadets to be in that sort of situation before they'd even been commissioned. But it got better because we were carrying along, and suddenly out of the bushes came three guys running from central base, and our troop was able to engage them and eliminate them. So that was a wonderful experience for the cadets. And then they got to central base and were shown around the bashes and everything else. Brilliant exposure. And they all went off a few months later and acquitted themselves very well also. So yeah, that was my spell at School of Infantry, Hooterville as it was known, and then I was posted from there to Headquarters 2 Brigade as the Grade 3 Staff Officer. That meant I was a captain, GSO 3 Operations, at the nucleus of what was Operation Hurricane, based in Bandura, and I moved my young wife to Bandura, and we set up home there in an old broken down mine cottage, and we had a lovely time there at Bandura, made lots of friends, and had an extremely interesting spell as a staff officer there on the headquarters. You were involved in all of the major operations.
Yes, I want to pick your brains on that a little bit, because even when I was at the School of Infantry, I think it was daily or twice a week, we had to go into a large tent, and there were maps of the whole country, and where all the contacts were taking place, a little pin was going into the map. And when you looked at the map, it was just pins everywhere. And I thought, dear God, what am I going into? You know, because the whole eastern border was pins and a bit in the west. And so you must have seen an awful lot of pins in your headquarters at Bindera. What sort of things were flowing through the network while you were in the headquarters there?
You know, initially the maps were very bland. They were ordnance survey maps with the normal detail on them, etc., etc. It was only later on that, and I have to say that we brought this back from our staff force later on, was we did terrain studies on the maps where we colored in the high ground and accentuated the roads, accentuated the rivers, and so on, until you could get a much better view if you were a JOC member sitting at the JOC table, because otherwise it was just a great sheet of paper up on the wall and with a pin in it, and you had no idea really where that was. So yes, at that stage, yes, we did have the pins up there, but I think they were taken away, and the new lot of pins put up almost every day. Otherwise, it would have been thick with pins.
Yeah, and so that was obviously Op Hurricane. Did you
Yeah.
Can you recall any sort of major incidents that came through your headquarters at that point that you were overseeing?
Well, I think we were seeing the evolution of the Fireforce at that stage, because the RLI was their JOC was up at Mount Darwin, and they were working in the Kandaya and the Chesa and the places like that. And to start with, it was very much like people doing high density operations, trying to enclose the insurgents within a net, so to speak. But later on, the OP, the observation post, followed up by a helicopter-borne reaction force, began to become more commonly used. But it was only the advent of the 20 millimeter, I think it was a Spano, I don't know if it was a Spano cannon or what it was, but 20 millimeter cannon that could be mounted into an LOA-3 that changed the thing from being just a little bit of a deterrent with the 3.0 Browning coming out the side to something that was truly a lethal weapon in the sky. So yeah, I don't recall too many incidents. There was the abduction of Gerald Hawksworth. I remember that quite clearly. And then I think a couple of other abductions that took place. But there were lots of, fleeting contacts, lots of reasonably good kills, etc.
Those 20.
But you're asking me detail from 50 years back.
I know, a bit unfair. I thought some might stick in your mind, but the 20 mil Hispanos were actually out of the vampires when they scrapped them, or they just took the guns out of the vampires. I think later on, as the numbers increased, well, the South Africans came in with their own 20 mils, I think, but the few that we had were from the vampires, if I remember correctly. But if there's anybody with better knowledge than me, I'm always willing to learn. So
I think Professor Richard Wood might know where it came from. But anyway, yes, I can't comment on that, Tony. I don't know exactly where they came from. But it was a game changer for us in terms of the tactics which could be used. Anyway, I remained in my staff job at Headquarters 2 Brigade for about 18 months, I guess. And then out of the blue came what we call an ERE posting. That's an extra regimental employment. That would mean that I was no longer going to my parent regiment, but I was posted to 1st Battalion Rhodesian African Rifles to take over their E Company, which was a bit of an offshoot company that was based in Mashonaland rather than in Matabeleland and Bulawayo. So at first I was absolutely gutted because I'd set my heart on going back to RLI as a commando commander, and I knew that as soon as I was posted to the RAR that wasn't going to happen. Anyway, I very soon began to recognize and value the attributes of the African soldiers in the RAR. They were extremely loyal, extremely resilient, hardworking, and they were very good soldiers. And I realized that they had uses beyond some of their white counterparts. And it was those uses that I really wanted to try and capitalize on, because I could see there was some potential there.
Can you expand on those differences a little bit?
Well, look, the African soldier, the RAR soldier, he could sit in an OP and he could see what was happening in a village, and he would know straight away whether what he was seeing was associated with the insurgents or whether that was just the everyday life of the village. And he would know from the number of dwellings in that village just how many people would be living there. And, those were little things. He would be able to know when somebody was lying and when they were telling the truth.
Yeah.
And he would be just as good when he was on patrol and going there into the village and having a look around for himself. So, and then I'm going to come to the Fireforce later on, but they were really versatile soldiers. They could do anything, as they proved later on when they became paratroopers as well towards the end of the war, 1978. So, yeah, the RAR soldier endeared himself to me. I tried very hard to learn the language, and the more I learned, the more I valued, because they warmed to my efforts to learn the language. And I also realized that I should have been learning it all the way through my life, but I hadn't. So that was a big takeaway for me. I missed out. So
that's been a common thread through all of the interviews, that most of us have expressed sadness that we never learned the indigenous languages. I was taught Afrikaans. I mean, and other people learned French. We should have been taught, is it Chishona, Shona, Ndebele? I mean, really, that's what we should have learned. And it would have helped us in the army as well, because how often did we sneak into villages at night and you hadn't got a clue what they were talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah, undoubtedly. We were very short on language skills. Anyway, so there I was, a very green company commander as a major in my RAR company. And I have to say, I had wonderful help from my 2IC who nurtured me. He'd been in the RAR a while, and he taught me the do's and don'ts, which was great. We started off, I met my company up at a place called Pachanza, which is north of Mount Darwin. We found that there wasn't much going on in Op Hurricane at that stage. I think there had been some interesting developments as far as Zanla was concerned. And that was that the Portuguese had their coup in Mozambique, in Portugal. And as a result of that, they had given up on their counterinsurgency operations in their colonies. So from having a reasonably secure eastern border, and even a northern border from sort of Mukumbura east or Kanyemba eastwards, suddenly all that was open season. And Zanla could see the potential for teaming up with Frelimo and using their movement corridors to penetrate Rhodesia down its eastern border. So that, I think, was possibly why they were withdrawing a lot of their cadres to reorganize them for the offensive, which obviously they were going to mount. But it gave me an opportunity to get to know my troops. Before too long, we were redeployed down into the valley to a place called Caetano, which had been turned into a collective village when the war was at its height in the early part of Hurricane. And there I met up with a young district officer who'd been charged with restoring the civil authority in that area and making sure that there was enough food for the villagers over the succeeding winter and so on, and also to make sure that the security of that village could withstand another incursion of Zanla. So we became pretty good friends, and we worked very well together, I thought anyway, in this village. And we were exposed, or I was exposed, to farming for the first time, because not only did we have to sort out the livestock program, but we also had to get their fields ready for that summer planting. And the problem that we had was that these guys had been collected together in the collective village, or CV as it was called, had come from all over the place. So their fields were miles away, and we couldn't afford to be trekking miles for them to plant. So we had to consolidate the fields as well, and that involved trying to take measurements of the hectareages and make sure that we had enough hectareage at a relatively low yield to be able to provide food for the inhabitants of the village. So that was pretty interesting. We had guys come from Ministry of Water Development to sort out the water supply, sand extraction units. And we also had some good old roadie farmers to come and help us with the plowing. And somehow somebody produced a tractor and a plow, and away they went plowing during their call-ups. So it was a very interesting time for me. And we got busy with jacking up the road systems and converting the village from a CV to a PV. And that was by putting in a proper fence around the village. By the time we left, admittedly, we'd had no incidents whatsoever. By the time we left, we were showered with all sorts of gifts of goats and chickens and goodness knows what else from the villagers. So it was a very satisfying experience. And we left there on a bit of a high. We went back to Jock Darwin, and we were based in Tito and got involved in these high-density operations which were being run there. Then suddenly, out of the blue, in the Easter of 1976, we were told to redeploy to the Hondi Valley. Well, I'd never heard of the Hondi Valley before. I had no idea where it was. I had no idea what it looked like or what it did. And so anyway, off we went. And we were really taken by surprise when we arrived at the lip of the escarpment and looked down into this incredible valley with its huge mountains, all covered in forests, and little villages perched in little clearings miles from anywhere. And the only way to get to it was by going along a tunnel of greenery or down a forest path. So we knew straight away that if that area was subverted, that we were going to be in a certain amount of trouble. And by the time we got to the valley floor and we saw the averted eyes and the guys who wouldn't look at you and the youths loitering at the stores and so on, we knew that these guys had already been programmed by the insurgents. And sure enough, we couldn't get any decent workable intel because nobody had been captured. And so we were very much boxing in the dark with our hands behind our back.